conversation 6 or 7 years ago between two people who have heroic numbers on people who watch their videos on YouTube. And one of them made the statement that, the average attention span of a YouTube video viewer is about 1.5 minutes, maybe 3 minutes tops. And so you really should figure out how to boil down all of your content to 1.5 to 3 minutes. Whatever it is you have to say, it should fit in that time frame. And the person that they had been speaking with was actually someone who had been their mentor. And they replied, that is not what I find. In fact, I find that I have more viewers who watch every minute of an hour-long video than I have people who watch every minute of a 5 to 12-minute video or even a 20-minute video. In fact, the longer the video is, the more people tend to watch the entire thing, which really flies in the face of a lot of the announced or publicized statistics that you find on YouTube and other social media. But I think there's an interesting reason why that's true, and I heard that in a debate among intellectuals on a long video that I watched last night. And that's what I want to share with you today about leadership. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. And I had to make a long drive over the last couple of days, 3 hours out and 3 hours back for a family issue. But the drive time for me is very seldom wasted time because that's the time that I like to study. And if I can keep a strong enough cell signal, I will put on my noise canceling headphones and I will find something that's intellectually stimulating and I will hit play. And for me, the longer I can stay in that same conversation, the better. But part of the conversation that I listened to last night, two of them were political, and then one of them was psychological, that some would say is political, but it's really not. It's about psychology that people have tried to politicize. But there was a profound statement made by the character, the individual that I was listening to, and this was just an open forum where there were a lot of people gathered for Q&A. And I think I've talked about this video before. I know that I've watched it before, maybe not to the very end. Last night I got all the way to the very end. This particular one is called the Aspen Idea Summit or something like that. And it was Jordan Peterson and whoever the host was for that particular event. At one point she asks him, or someone in the crowd asks him, have you ever made a mistake? And he said, yeah, of course I've made mistakes. And they said, well, have you ever made a mistake that you've had to own up to and it was hard? And he thought for a moment and then tried to explain his answer in a way that everyone could conceive of it and actually put it in play. And it was a complicated answer, not because he was unwilling to admit that he had made mistakes, but because being able to apply that same rationale, coming to the same conclusion of yourself, it's a hard thing to do because it demands not only heightened self-awareness, but incredible self-discipline. When she asked him what was the mistake that you made, he said, I remember for years that I would not be precise in what I was saying. I would use words and quotes and phrases that came out of books that weren't necessarily mine. Meaning I had heard them and I read them and I could quote them and I understood them enough to know what they mean, but I hadn't experienced them. I hadn't taken ownership of those phrases. And when I realized that I was doing that often, listen closely, just to express my intellectual superiority, I put a lot of judgment on myself and I had to stop doing that. To be more precise in my communication meant that I needed to not only know about or know of these precepts and these concepts, not just platitudes that I could quote and requote and put in the proper context, but life experiences that I'd earned the right to talk about. Now, if you've heard me teach on story power at all, one of the things that I love is the old phrase from Dale Carnegie, you've got to earn the right to tell the story. And you may earn it by observing it, and that being closely related to the incident of the story. You might earn it because you've done significant research, and you might earn it because you've actually lived through the experience of that circumstance. What Dr. Peterson was saying is that there are a whole lot of people who quote platitudes to you, a whole lot of people who've read the statistics, they understand what the books say, they've even maybe read the history of how these things impact people, and the result of them having done that is that they feel like they know what it is that they're expressing. Well, they may know the statistic behind it, and they might know the history behind it, but if they haven't experienced it, they don't have an emotional knowledge of that thing. Now, his willingness to say, that was a mistake that I made, that's a big deal. And often leaders don't have the veracity to do that. Leaders don't take complete responsibility for the decisions they make and the things that they say. Oftentimes, they'll do like we see in leadership right now, where it is, well, I'm going to pass the buck. I'm going to say that I'm taking responsibility, but the responsibility I'm taking is to tell you that it was his fault. They gave me the information. They misled me. I trusted the wrong people. Rather than to say, I own this, I should have done the research myself. I should have even looked into the data that was given me rather than simply believing it. And that's a challenge with leaders who are unwilling to take full responsibility to say, it was me. It was on me. When I say the buck stops here, that means every decision that's finally made, before a name goes on the dotted line, before orders are executed, it's up to me to decide, did my team make the right decision? Did they give me the right information? And that's on me. It also means that a leader who's willing to do that also has to stand behind the decision to say, if there's consequences for being wrong, if there's fallout because of this idea, that's on me too. And that's a really tough place to be. But I also want to go one step further, because that debate offered something that I found fascinating. There was a gentleman in the audience who was a linguist, and he challenged Dr. Peterson. Now, this guy's also a professor. He's also a PhD. He's also a very educated guy, this linguist. He challenged Dr. Peterson on a phrase that Dr. Peterson used when he said, when someone asked me to call them by a specific gender, for an example, I have a bit of a leg up in that it is my background, it is my profile, it is my education, it is my 30 years of history to understand the psychology of someone and to be able to make the judgment of whether or not they're asking this from a deep need of their emotional standpoint, or if they're asking this as a form of manipulation. And the linguist really wanted to challenge him on that. And it sounded to me as if the linguist had an agenda, not just a good debate, but wanted to get Dr. Peterson to say, listen, maybe I'm wrong on this, or maybe we should just go one way or the other. And so they talked about risk, they talked about rewards, they talked about error, they talked about marginalizing the error or minimizing the error by simply falling to one side or the other and taking the risk. The decision you make in how you execute, will I call everyone by the pronoun they choose, or will I pick one person at a time? He said, I have to make that decision, and I have to make that decision based on my own expertise, my own experience, my own ability to evaluate a person's emotional state and whether or not they really need me to call them by this other pronoun, or if they're just trying to manipulate. The linguist really wasn't happy with the fact that Dr. Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist and professor, felt like he could make a psychological assessment on the fly. The result was the linguist felt like it was unfair that, quote, psychology, these are his words, psychology had nothing to teach us about how we should determine as a society whether or not these people really needed to be called by another pronoun. He had a real hard time pressing that through, and Dr. Peterson never really answered it to his satisfaction. I think I have an analogy for you. I was watching Rust to Riches, which is a show about cars. And in the show, Rust to Riches, they brought in this old school bus and they were trying to crank it over. And the guy called Caveman was doing all that he knew how. He was priming the pump. He was putting fuel straight into the carburetor, trying to get it to crank over, etc., etc. And the young lady, who happens to be the specialist on old muscle car engines, is standing there trying to help him get it started. And at one point, he says, I think it needs more fuel. I think it needs this. I think it needs that. And she says, I think you need to acknowledge that this motor is dead. And he said, what do you mean? She said, look, it's got some kind of internal mechanical failure. I can tell by the sound of it, it shouldn't be making that clackety-clack sound while you're trying to start it. And the black smoke coming out is a dead giveaway. Now, this guy was a mechanic as well. He's been working on cars and stuff for years. That's why he's on the show with her. But her superior expertise in reading the condition of the motor was enough for him to say, you're right, it's time that we pull it and replace it with something completely different. Her ability to assess, based on her experience and her expertise, was enough for him to say, you're right, I'm wrong, I give. If Dr. Jordan Peterson can listen to someone with 30 years of expertise in analyzing someone's verbiage and the way they tell their story as to what their actual needs are versus what they're expressing, then I believe he's eminently qualified to say, yeah, I believe this person's trying to manipulate me. And it's not a judgment, if you will, of the quality of the person or even the person's needs. It is an assessment of, are they being honest or are they not? Now, one other thing that came from that conversation, besides the genuine acknowledgement, which I don't think the linguist ever came to, that the professor of psychology and the experienced clinical psychologist probably has an upper leg on most average people in reading other people. The other thing that was fascinating was when they challenged him on his YouTube videos and they said, how did you get to be so popular? He said, I just decided back in 2013, who knew he'd been around that long? But he's been a professor since I got out of high school. He said, back in 2013, I decided to put a few of my lectures, classroom lectures, up on YouTube. And when I broke the 1 million views mark, it was 1 million views of long, deep, heady conversation, intellectually stimulating conversation. And that's not the norm. That's not what people would expect. And she said, well, I've watched a couple of debates that you've had recently that went on for 2.5 hours. Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, as an example. She said, why do you think 500,000 people watched 2 hours of that conversation? His answer was profound. It was this. He said, I think we find ourselves at a place in society today where people are missing from academics, from the media, from their education even, they're missing true intellectual stimulation. And so when they find someone who's willing to pour into them, to challenge them, to make them think, they take the time to listen intently. Now, personally, I thought I was a freak because that is my MO. That's the way I operate. I love deep, thoughtful, intellectual stimulation that I can spend hours even listening to it and then listening again. I have an audio of Dr. Caroline Leaf where she talks about quantum physics and neuropsychology and how they interact with each other. I've listened to it probably a dozen times or more each year for the last 5 years. No exaggeration. I've probably listened to that audio 100 times easily. But it's because it stimulates me to think outside the box of what I hear normally. Outside the box of what I watch in politics, what I watch in normal psychology and normal leadership circles. And I think there's a hunger in a lot of people for that. Leaders have to take responsibility for the decisions that they make. And sometimes the decisions that they make are made flippantly. They're made without the depth and quality of having listened to people outside their wheelhouse. People who have depth of knowledge way beyond what they do. Why? Because it's hubris that says, I know. It's hubris that says, I once read it in a book and I can quote it. But it's genuine intellectual knowledge that says, let me keep poking at this and asking the question, could I know it better? Have I really experienced it? Have I earned the right to talk about it? Leaders need to make the decisions and then stand behind them that say, I once was wrong, but I won't be again, not on that topic, because I won't stop doing my homework until I get it right. That is a huge responsibility of leaders. Not to cast the blame, not to pass the buck, not to say, but my informers told me this was the right way to do it, but to genuinely and honestly research the topic until they own it themselves. If you're in any form of leadership, whether it's your small family or it's a giant organization or it's a military or political role, you don't have the right as a leader to pass the buck to somebody else for those decisions that you're ultimately responsible for. Nope, you need to do the homework yourself. You need to read up on it. You need to be well informed, and you need to earn the right to talk about it. So that's my challenge for you today. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting